Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Create and Consume, a podcast about what we make, watch, and buy in the era of digital content. I'm your host, Austen Tosone. According to some light Googling that I did and Pod News, upwards of 5 million podcasts are available to listen to on Spotify today. 44% of all podcasts have published fewer than 3 episodes, and only 720,000 podcasts have more than 10 episodes. According to Pod News, they also share that out of those 720,000 podcasts, only 156,000 are releasing a new weekly episode. So this is episode 26 of Create and Consume, which means today I am celebrating 6 months of podcasting. I'm sure I could wait until a full year to reflect back and tell you more, but I really want to have this podcast also let you in on the process and share a bit of the behind the scenes as I go. So today I thought it would be fun to reflect on my journey as a new podcaster so far. I'll talk about my overall thoughts with podcasting, challenges of starting a new podcast, what it costs to start a new podcast, and what equipment I use. And I'll also reveal what my top 5 podcast episodes have been so far. Let's get into it. First, I want to share what I've been creating and consuming this week. So, I have been posting these basically challenges on Instagram and TikTok lately that everyone seems to really enjoy. I have basically been doing a Sunday reset, but giving myself only 20 minutes to clean everything up. These have been pretty fun videos to create. My favorite part about these videos is definitely the finished product. I actually use a digital timer in my videos, which I believe I talked about a few episodes back. I'm showing you on the screen if you are watching this episode on YouTube. But basically, these are actually kind of hard to film because I want to actually be cleaning and sticking to my allotted time limit, but making sure that I take the timer and move it and get it in the right position and that I am filming for, the right amount of time. It's actually really tricky to put together, but the finished product is very satisfying if I do say so myself. So I will leave a link in the show notes to my latest challenge from this past Sunday if you'd like to go watch that. And in terms of what I'm consuming this week, can we just all agree that Only Murders in the Building is like the perfect fall show? I always wonder how they're going to take this premise and like redo it season after season. And there's always an interesting way that I feel like they're able to pull it off from a story perspective. I have absolutely loved this season's kind of various plot lines, from the Westies, the people in the West Tower of their building, to the little romance subplots along the way. I still have, I think, 2 episodes left. We might have started episode 9 and gotten distracted, but I still need to finish the series, so do not text me spoilers. I loved the episode they did with the various camera angles. I think that might have been episode 6 or 7. I thought that was really smart and well done. I'm sitting here talking about how hard it was for me to film a TikTok where I include the digital timer, but when I think about filming an episode like that of a television show, I realize that I get off easy in comparison. I thought the Long Island episode, if you've watched, was the slowest one of the season so far. It just felt like there was a lot of filler in there, but it wasn't the end of the world. I mean, I still watched and enjoyed. But yeah, I can't wait to finish that show and see how everything pans out. I hope that show gets renewed for season 5. I mean, it is just so enjoyable, like a true pleasure watch. Now that we've got that covered, let's move on to today's main topic of conversation, which is reflecting on my first 6 months as a podcaster. And I have to say, podcasts have really become so integrated into my daily routine just as a listener in the last few years that I feel like it was sort of inevitable that at some point I would want to launch one of my own. I think early on I really thought that I would love it, but I'm here to tell you now that I'm 6 months in that I officially love it. I think it is just such a fun outlet. I think that there is so much you can do even just by creating one long form piece of content, like a long form audio podcast, and how you can even stretch that material and, use it in other areas of your business or put the recordings on YouTube as I do with my podcast. And it has just been such a creative outlet for me. And before I kind of made this big switch over on my YouTube channel in October, where I was talking about wanting to branch out beyond just my content creation tips, the podcast kind of filled this like lifestyle-y content void that I felt like I was missing from my content. And it really provided me an opportunity to close that gap, to be more personal, to be a little bit less scripted, and to give my audience another way to hear from me each week and get to know me and talk about things beyond just the usual, like, quote unquote, content pillars. Sometimes there are these niche topics or themes that pop up that you want to comment on or that you think would be a fun episode, but don't make sense for like a searchable YouTube video. And I can talk more about that a little later in the episode. What I'm trying to get at here as my overall thought is that it's really been a fantastic creative outlet for me. And I can still truly call this a creative outlet right now because at this time I am not making any money from the podcast. I am, doing what I can to promote the podcast in some ways, but right now it's not necessarily about being the best or the biggest or worrying about competition. It's really just about creating something each week that I'm proud of. And, when you turn content creation into your full-time career, you'd think that would still be the primary focus. And ideally, I want that to be the primary focus of like what I do day to day. But I am also running a business and I am also trying to put out strategic content to attract brands and do all of these things. So to have something that is purely within my creative direction and control that, if I put out an episode and later I am like, oh, maybe people didn't really listen to that one, or oh, maybe I could have like approached that topic differently. It really doesn't hit as hard as like when a reel flops or like a YouTube video has a really low click through rate. For some reason, there's just something a lot less worrisome about it to me and a lot less anxiety inducing. And I think obviously part of that is that it's still new, but I also kind of went into it knowing, obviously, in an ideal world, I would love for this to tie into my business and work with advertisers and grow and expand and things like that. But right now, it kind of just gets to be like this little cozy corner of the internet that I created. And it reminds me of just the early days of even starting my blog. And when I read those stats at the top of the episode and even started to think about how many podcasts out there don't make it past 3 episodes, don't make it past 10 episodes, it makes me really proud that I've been able to be consistent with the podcast over the last 6 months. I think something else that's come about from the podcast that I wasn't totally expecting, but of course makes sense since this was a brand new venture that I was starting this year, is this idea to remember to continue to challenge myself as a content creator, even after all these years. As you probably know, if you're listening to this episode and you've listened to previous episodes, I actually started my blog back in 2012. So I've been a content creator for over 10 years. And I think that even with the evolution of social media platforms and short form video and all of these other things that have emerged in the last decade, sometimes it is easy to just kind of stay in your lane and do the same thing and expect different results. And I think that one thing I've been trying to be more cognizant of and more mindful of is to not be afraid to be a beginner again and not be afraid to experiment and try new things, even if, what I've been doing has been working well, or I'm just in an easy rhythm when I write a certain type of blog post or put out a certain type of content. I think that teaching myself an entirely new medium has been really beneficial for me. And it has brought me back to that beginner mentality and has made me remember all of the new things and the new struggles that can come along with launching a new project. For example, when I first started recording the podcast, I was recording it on a totally different software. Right now, I'm using Riverside, which I like. I feel like I'm not really taking full advantage of it, but whatever. For recording purposes, it's working well for me. But when I first started, I was using a different software and I was really excited at first by some of the like AI tools and features that were pitched with the podcast software that, made your voice sound like extra good, like you were in a studio, and would just normalize everything automatically and enhance stuff and remove the ums and uhs. And I would edit within that software and I would export the episodes, and like half of my edits weren't saving. And I was like, well, what are all of these bells and whistles if I can't just have the basic cuts where I do cut out, silence or I don't know, hopefully you can't hear this because I've, smoothed it out or whatever, but like for some reason the pipes are kind of loud today in the apartment. Like all of those things where even just learning to edit and have audio be the primary thing I'm fixated on versus photo or video or even the written word, it just kind of flips things on its head, and it makes me look at how I record an episode differently and how I edit an episode differently. In fact, one of you guys actually messaged me about my second episode, I believe, that I uploaded. And I got this really nice message from someone who's followed me for a long time saying, hey, like, I I know your podcast is new and like I'm not trying to like, insult you or anything, but I noticed in the last episode there were a lot of like pauses and like coughs, and she said, I just feel like you're usually a bit more polished than that. So if that was the intention, like to be really unfiltered, I totally understand, but I just wanted to let you know. And I went and listened and was so embarrassed that the episode I had uploaded that I thought I had edited, like I said, within this software somehow didn't save like all of these edits that I made. And I actually had to remove that episode and re upload it, which was really frustrating. So, even just, going through that process of, okay, I'm going to start with this software, but choosing to switch quickly and find a different way to like make everything work for me, I think is really important and also part of that beginner mentality. Also, I just think the realization that podcasting is an extremely slow burn was something that I feel like was important for me to understand from the beginning before I even started, saying, I'm probably going to have to like self produce and promote this podcast for, I would guess, at least a year and a half, maybe even a little longer before I start working with advertisers or can pitch a podcast network or can have certain guests or whatever on the show. And that's something that I knew going in and that I decided I was totally okay with, especially because growing a podcast is not really like growing a new social media platform. I have a lot of friends who are happy to consume my content on Instagram, but who are just inherently not podcast listeners. And no matter how much they love me, they might not choose to listen to me over their usual like car mix on the way to work on Spotify. So I feel like it's a lot harder to convert someone over to being a podcast listener from a platform like Instagram or maybe even TikTok. But I do feel like I've had a lot of YouTube subscribers who have reached out to tell me they've been listening to the podcast too, which I think makes sense because it's like a long form meets long form type of situation. And maybe I'm just generalizing, but I think the point being that you either need like a really big following on a different platform to drive traffic to a podcast, or you have to be really thoughtful with how you optimize episodes so that if people are searching for certain topics in Spotify or Apple, that they can find you easily. And I knew that going in. And like I said, it's still a slow burn. I am still working towards kind of hitting some of those first milestones of a podcast, but every little bit helps. Every episode you listen to helps. Every episode you send to a friend helps. And most importantly, every review of the show that you leave helps more than you know. So if you've made it this far, if you've been with me for the last 6 months or you just started listening recently, if you could do me the world's biggest favor and pause this episode and go either on Spotify or Apple or Amazon Music, wherever you're listening to this podcast, and leave a quick rating and review. You can leave a review that's just one sentence. You can leave a review with like one word and a bunch of emojis, hopefully good ones and happy ones, but literally that helps more than you could ever possibly imagine. So if you have like 20 seconds to spare right now, please pause this episode and go leave me a rating and review on your preferred platform. Or if you're watching me on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. I think my biggest challenge with podcasting in the last few weeks, though, has definitely been promoting it on social media. When I first got started with the podcast, I knew I wanted to create like podcast accounts on Instagram, TikTok, obviously YouTube. And I also have Pinterest and X, but I kind of have just like put those on pause because this is just too many platforms in addition to all of the usual platforms that I post on. But oh my God, have just been so bad the last 3 weeks. Like, if you follow the podcast Instagram and you're like, well, she hasn't posted in 3 weeks, I haven't, and that's my bad. I don't know how to explain it. It's just that thing that always falls to the bottom of my to-do list and I'm looking at it and I'm like, I don't want to. And I know that the biggest reason is just because I hate having multiple social media accounts. Like I think having my own Instagram and my own TikTok is already too much. Like I hate having a second account to manage, and I'm sure other people who work in the industry can relate to this. When I worked at Jump Rope, I was managing the main Jump Rope Instagram, and we also had an Instagram for Jump Rope Beauty. And I'm not gonna lie, that was obviously not fun. And you'd think even having a second account for something that's like my passion project and something I'm excited about would be fun too. But I just don't enjoy the process of having to upkeep an additional social media account. And it's not because I don't like the content I create within the podcast. I enjoy that, of course, or I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I even like uploading the video to YouTube. It's just something about the short form and the promotion of a new episode that just feels like a notch too many. Like just one more thing on the to do list that I'm like, I can't do this right now. I think it's more important to get the episode out each week on Spotify and YouTube, and also the blog posts. I have been creating a blog post recap to go along with every single podcast episode. And when I say ChatGPT has been helping me a little bit, basically taking an episode outline, giving me a draft of a blog post, and then I'll go in and kind of edit from there. But the fact that each week now I'm already putting out 3 new pieces of like quote unquote long form content with the audio podcast, if you're listening on Spotify, the video podcast, if you're watching on YouTube, and the corresponding blog recap that also includes all of the links and things I mentioned. So if you ever in the future are like, oh, Austen was talking in the Trader Joe's episode about this thing, but you can't remember what the item was, you can go to createandconsumepodcast.com. You can find that episode, and I listed out like every product that I mentioned there. And I just want to make sure that that's clear that that is what the website is for. So if you guys ever forget things or want to read things or even just read a little extra summary before you dive into an episode to see if it's interesting to you, that is all on the website. So the fact that I'm already doing those 3 things, I'm like, that's a lot already. And so, yeah, the social has fallen by the wayside. But what I think I really need to do is maybe even just temporarily figure out a new system where I am like scheduling out 3 weeks of those posts at a time or something like that. I would obviously love to in the future hire a virtual assistant to help with that and ultimately to take over editing of the podcast for me, because at the end of the day, since this is the thing I've been doing for the least amount of time, I think I'm also the least attached to editing style. And if you watch on YouTube, you know I don't necessarily do anything that fancy when it comes to the editing either. I just post the upload from the time I start talking, all of the ums and uhs and cranky pipes or creaky pipes, whatever they are cut out in the middle. And you're left with basically the audio version, but also with a visual component. In case you want to see what I'm wearing today. Like today, for example, I'm wearing my Lingua Franca sweater that says Austen on it. This was a gift from a brand. I did not buy it myself. So, anyway, all of those challenges, like the beginner mentality stuff, having to switch softwares, just knowing it's a slow burn, and managing additional social media accounts are some of the early challenges that I've encountered since I started the podcast. But all of these things are just things that I kind of take in stride and figure out. And there's really no problem I can't solve at this point. After being self employed for the last 3 years, you have to learn how to figure things out for yourself. And that's one of the things I'm most grateful for about this entrepreneurship journey. So, to give you a little peek behind the curtain of my current podcasting setup and equipment checklist, this is basically everything I use to actually make the podcast. And I'll get into the cost of starting the podcast as well. So, as you may tell, I am using my laptop right now. That is kind of my central hub. And on the left side of my screen, I have my episode outline for this week. And on the right side of the screen, I can see myself in Riverside, which is the platform that I use to record this podcast. Now, like I said earlier, I don't think I'm taking full advantage of everything Riverside has to offer. Right now, I use it as my recording studio, which I like because it basically has a webcam-esque setup, but instead of using my computer's built-in webcam on my MacBook Pro from, when did I get this? 2022 maybe? I'm actually using my iPhone 15 Pro Max as a webcam, and this is a capability I discovered on whatever the latest version of iOS is, where I am able to kind of pair it and use it as a webcam instead of using my laptop webcam. Now, I like this because it gives me the capability to shoot in 1080p, which I think is stronger quality than what you get on the webcam. But the other thing I like about it is if you're watching on YouTube right now, I'm staring directly at the iPhone camera. If I were to be staring at my laptop camera, if you look, my eyes just shifted. Now it looks like I'm looking down. So for YouTube purposes, I like the idea of being able to have a camera that's a bit more at eye level. And right now, my phone is actually on a phone stand that I got off of Amazon. And it is just a, well, here, I'll mess up my fancy setup for 1 second and show you. But here is the phone stand that my phone is usually on when I'm recording the podcast. So it just sits right here. You can, in theory, tilt this stand a little bit, but I always just kind of keep it the way that I keep it. And I do prop up a little cardboard behind my phone just to keep it even. So that is on my back wall, but if you don't have a wall, you could also just put your phone up on a tripod and do the same exact thing. And then, as you may be able to see, I will hold up my mic a little bit higher to hopefully this doesn't mess up my audio too much, but I am using a microphone that I bought off of Amazon, and it is just connected to my laptop with a USB-C to USB-C cord. Now, this microphone also has XLR capabilities. If you're like, what is that? I'm not entirely sure either. That's why I am just using the USB-C plug-in method with this microphone. But basically, if and when I personally graduate to using XLR for audio, it just means that I could plug the microphone into a mixer. It would, in theory, give me better audio and more control over audio. But for purposes of being a beginner and not having any idea what that really means, I am just plugging the microphone into my laptop and selecting it as what I'm talking into when I'm on Riverside. And then, so that is the right side of my screen is the Riverside setup where I can see myself. And then on the left side of the screen, I have my outline, like I mentioned, within Notion. And the reason that I like hosting all of my podcast episode outlines and everything in Notion is because I am able to, I basically like created a podcast hub for myself where I have one page that's like all my upcoming episode ideas. And then I have another page where I can really specifically schedule out each episode. And it looks basically like a block system. So just to pop out of my outline for a second, I have one column that says outlining. Then I have another column that says ready to record. That's where this episode outline is right now. Then I have a column for editing, scheduling, and promoting. So I basically just drag the episode along the timeline depending what point in the episode I'm at. So as soon as I'm done recording this, I will move this outline from ready to record to editing. So I know that this episode needs to be edited. And again, what I like about Notion is I am also able to create a template so that when I create a new episode in this little system I created, I can click a button that says episode outline and it will auto populate with an intro, a hook, create and consume, main talking points, like basically all of the little bullet points that I need for each episode. And then underneath that, I also have it populate, the outro that I do at the end of each episode, like where I encourage you to leave reviews or tell friends and things like that. And then all the way down, I also have an outline for a blog post. And I also have an outline for the show notes that already comes ready to go with all of the links that I typically include in the show notes and the format that I usually write blog posts in. So being able to have like a built-in outline for every episode just speeds up my production process. And I like that I can do it all in Notion where things are just really easy to drag and drop, and I like that my notes are in the same place as my schedule and so on. Maybe at some point I'll make my podcast Notion template available for podcasters, but I feel like I should continue to test it for another 6 months just to make sure that this is really the right system for me and that I don't have any tweaks that I need to put in place. So that is everything on the recording front. Now, when it comes to editing, I could technically edit in Riverside, but given that I was a little scarred from the last podcast editing software I tried to use, I decided, you know what, I just want to make things easy for myself. So when I'm done recording in Riverside, what I do is export that video to my desktop and then I just edit in iMovie. And, there's something to be said for the simplicity of iMovie. I just have it down to such a science now. I like that I can see the spikes of when I'm talking versus if, I see the audio dip down, maybe there's someone in the hallway or I have to sneeze or, there's a moment of quiet while I'm in between thoughts that just makes it easier and faster for me to cut in between the actual meat of the episode. And it's just an easy, free way to edit the video portion. So first I edit the video portion and then I export it. And from that same file in iMovie, you can choose to select both video and audio or just audio only. So after I export the video that you see on YouTube, I also just export that audio. And I don't do my intro, outro music on YouTube, mostly because I feel like there's just not a good way to do that right now. But what I do is I take the audio from that video, then I bring it back into iMovie where I then add the intro and outro music, and then I export that a second time. And that is the final audio file that you end up listening to when you're listening on I almost said Spodcast. That's not a thing. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, etc. And I purchased my podcast intro music from a website called Pond 5, and I usually use Epidemic Sound for YouTube videos, but instead of worrying about paying for an Epidemic Sound song for my podcast, what I did with Pond 5 is I was able to buy just the one individual track. Because for Epidemic Sound, it's great to have the subscription on YouTube where I'm changing music a lot within vlogs depending on the mood. But my intro song for the podcast is the intro song. It doesn't really need to change. So I was able to, like I said, just purchase the rights for that song one time to use, at the intro and outro of the show when you listen. Okay, so how much does it cost to actually launch a podcast? And this is something that, again, because I don't make any money from the podcast right now, I was willing to invest a little bit of money and a good amount of time. And I think that those are like the right way to describe what I'm about to tell you in terms of this breakdown. So, in terms of the basics and things I think that you definitely would need if you're starting a podcast, number one, a microphone. I mean, that is like kind of non-negotiable at this point, but there are plenty of options. My microphone, I went back and looked at the receipt from the time I bought it. It said it was $57. And again, I got it from Amazon. I will link this in the show notes in case you're interested in this exact microphone. And then I purchased the phone mount on Amazon too that I said I use for my phone screen, which is the camera that I use. And as I already told you, I use my camera on my phone as the camera to record the video portion of the podcast. And the phone mount that I use is also from Amazon, and it cost me about $10. When it comes to Riverside, my recording software, I chose a plan where I pay $180 for the year. So that works out to, $15 a month to record the podcast. And again, the reason I like recording on Riverside is number one, it's on my laptop, so I can have it up right next to my notes. And number two, Riverside is storing this raw copy for me, at least for a little while. I think it expires after a certain number of days, but I just like knowing that the raw copy is there if for some reason I have a bad edit and I have to go back, and I don't necessarily have to worry about the podcast eating up space on my camera memory cards. There are also, like I said, lots of features on Riverside that I feel like I'm not taking advantage of yet as a podcaster, but I feel like I still have time to discover those and make better use of the software. For my editing software, I use iMovie, like I told you, and that is free. That comes pre-installed on every Apple computer. If you want, you could also look into CapCut, or I think DaVinci might be free as well, or a certain version of it. Or if you choose to purchase a software like Riverside, you can obviously edit within that too. I would just say be careful and make sure that you understand how web editing works and make sure that everything is saving properly and that everything is just running smoothly as you edit. Again, for me, iMovie is the most basic, most user friendly editing platform for long form right now. So that's what I'm using. And for my intro song on Pond 5, I don't know if they were having a sale or what, or if this is just what it cost, but I paid $3.20, a one time fee, to use this song that you hear, dun 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 dun, however it goes, as my intro music. So I think that's a pretty good deal. So all in, so far that's around like $250 for a microphone, recording software, an intro song, all of that stuff. I also have two other things that I chose to invest in that I guess aren't necessary if you're just getting started from the podcast, but if you do want the podcast to be like a serious part of your business, that I would probably suggest. Number one is a website. So I chose to launch my podcast website on Squarespace just because I'm very used to Squarespace. So I paid $192 for the year. Again, I think that's like $16 a month for my website on Squarespace for the podcast. And I just like having a home and a separate hub for the podcast that is apart from all of my personal brand stuff. So I like that I have createandconsumepodcast.com, that domain secured. I like that I can publish episode recaps that are kind of like blog posts to hopefully at some point show up in a search or start ranking if I can spend more time on those in the future. And if I ever want to grow, create, and consume as a brand more and, I don't know, do merch or do live shows or all of these other things that I see podcasters do, once they really build and develop a listenership, I just feel like all of that is made easier by having a website. So for that reason, I chose to invest in that. Again, I think that's pretty reasonable. I did also choose to work with a lawyer to file a trademark for my podcast name. So that trademark has been submitted. I'm just waiting to see if they need any additional paperwork or anything from us and see what they end up saying about that. Sometimes you file a trademark and it's an easy approval. Sometimes they need additional specimens or supplemental evidence to show, how you've been using the name and stuff like that. That cost will vary. I chose to use a lawyer just to streamline the process and do it for me. Veronica has helped me secure other trademarks for my business, so I just went through her. That was an investment I was willing to make. But even if you just want to file an intent to use trademark and you decide to go about it on your own, there are different filing fees that vary, I think, between states. So it's something worth looking into. Again, if you see it being part of like a long-term thing that you really want to stick with. And I think, again, it's really important to just stress and talk about how much time I have spent towards the podcast. And again, that doesn't necessarily cost me in the same way that, hiring like a podcast editor or a virtual assistant would cost me. And in some ways, that's just the trade off. So, like I said, right now, since I'm not really making money from the podcast, I have chosen to take on a lot of those activities on my own. And as a result, that adds a lot of time that I was previously spending on other areas of my business to this specific area. I think it's totally worthwhile because I definitely see the growth potential and the opportunities ahead for the podcast. And I'm willing to put off, immediate financial return for long-term gratification, knowing that I am in a sense playing the long game. But it's worth mentioning that it changes your schedule and that you do want to make sure you're setting aside a few hours a week to do all of these podcast tasks. And like I said, I have even been kind of slacking on the podcast promotion lately, and that has simply been like a time issue for me. I would say that scripting an episode usually takes me anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour. The Taylor Swift episode probably took the longest, I would say. That was probably more like an hour and a half to fully script that. Recording usually takes me about an hour. Editing usually takes me another hour. Uploading to Spotify and YouTube probably takes me another 45 minutes to an hour. And then putting the blog post together usually takes me like another 45 minutes. So that's what, 5-ish hours a week, let's call it, just to put out one podcast episode. And, that just also left out the social promotion, which clearly I keep forgetting about. I don't want to abandon the Instagram account. It's just, I'm just one person, So hopefully I can get at least that outsourced to a virtual assistant soon. But this is also just a reminder for any podcast that you listen to. There is so much work and it's such a labor of love that goes into them. And it's something that I obviously figured I understood as someone who created other types of content before becoming a podcaster. But it is something I really, really appreciate now that I'm seeing firsthand exactly what goes into it. And I would say that I have a relatively not low effort podcast situation, but I record at home. I can choose the time I want to record. I set up, I get to wear comfy clothes and work from home and do all these things. It's very much on my own time and my own schedule. It's a very low stress situation, but even, with a simple setup and trying to make it easy for myself, it still requires a lot of thought and a lot of time. So that's definitely something, like I said, I was pretty aware of before I actually launched my podcast, but just something that I think is important to keep in mind. And it makes me appreciate all of the podcasts that I listen to even more. Now, of the 25 episodes that I've released up until this point, I thought it would be fun to just share what my top 5 episodes so far have been. And I know this is a small sample pool of data, but I was personally curious, so I thought you guys might like to know too. I think it's no surprise that the top episode is episode 1, which was called Why I'm Starting a Podcast. And when people find out I have a podcast, I'm pretty sure if you go to, Apple or Spotify, whatever you click on, it will show the episodes in chronological order. So if you're brand new and you just are coming on, of course, you're going to see episode 1, Why I'm Starting a Podcast. But I do think that probably is a good first one for people to listen to, because I think right now most people who listen to the podcast know me, unless you've somehow just stumbled upon me on Spotify or Apple. In that case, hello, I'm so glad you did. But I think that people who know me at least know a little bit of my backstory and everything, but they probably want that question answered. Why is she starting a podcast? So no surprise that that's number 1, just because, like I said, I think that is what gets populated at the top when you click on a new podcast for the first time. And I think it answers just the question behind why a podcast. My second most popular episode so far was actually episode number 7, and that was my summer bucket list. And this, I feel like, could have shown up in search, especially on Spotify, people looking for that kind of lighthearted chat, that kind of conversation, or maybe even they heard another podcast do a summer bucket list. I can almost guarantee I was not the only one to do that. And if they were looking for that, maybe they also stumbled across mine to hear what I had to say about that. So I definitely think that having a seasonal episode like that each season is a fun one to do. This is not on the list, but if you guys didn't get a chance to listen to Autumn Girlies Rise Up, I really enjoyed recording that one too. This one was convenient. My third most popular episode was episode 3, which was my Trader Joe's hit list. You guys really seem to enjoy that one. I actually heard people even leave me feedback and say that they got some new dinner ideas and things like that. So maybe I'll have to expand on that topic in the future. My fourth most popular episode was episode number 6, Social Media State of the Union. I was happy to see this on the top, and this was actually, I think, one of the longest episodes I've put out so far. I've noticed that at first my episodes started out kind of long and have gotten a little shorter, but I think that's also because I am learning as I go what is really worth mentioning in an episode, especially now that I have been editing my own episodes. It's am I going to be mad when I say this later and have to edit it out? Maybe. So why don't I just skip saying that right now and save myself the trouble later? Also, I'm just one person and we know I can babble, but how much babbling is actually worth you hearing? And that's also where, of course, editing comes in. As I'm recording this episode right now, I just hit the 51-minute mark, but I imagine this episode will fall somewhere closer to mid 30s if I had to guess time wise. So I guess we'll see, depending on how much I continue to babble after this. And then my fifth most popular episode so far was From Print to Digital Media, which was kind of an overview of my career journey. I definitely want to do more career episodes over time. And then those were actually all from my first 10 episodes, which again, since this is like a smaller sample pool of data, I'm not really surprised by. But my sixth most popular episode was actually from just 2 weeks ago, which was about locking in and hitting your goals by 2025. So it makes me happy to hear that those goal setting episodes or kind of personal growth episodes are also interesting, or at least, the fact that that one's number 6 and it only came out 2 weeks ago, I think is telling. So that's something I'll be keeping an eye on as well. In terms of my future plans and goals with the podcast, first, I just really want to continue to stay consistent and putting out my weekly episodes. I think that is truly one of the best things that I can do, is continue to put out an episode every single week. Although I am going to take the week off between Christmas and New Year's. So Christmas is actually on a Wednesday this year. So that Thursday, the 26th, there will be no new episode, but there will be a new episode, I believe, January 2nd, the following Thursday. And I feel like that's the perfect time to make a return. I probably will try to record that episode, before that week off so that I can just have a week where I stare at a wall and don't do anything. I think no one should have to work during that week. I feel like we should make it just a global rule, unless you really want to. Another podcast goal is, of course, to keep up with my socials, but it's not necessarily because I want like podcast clips going viral, although I guess that could either be good or bad depending on what the clip is and what the reaction is. But I want to keep up with socials like Instagram specifically to mainly have a place for podcast listeners to like gather or comment on episodes or share their thoughts. Like for me, I think the community building component of being on social media is the most important part, not necessarily even just promoting the episodes, because I feel like the people who listen will listen, and it's not like I'm going to suddenly magically recruit hundreds of new listeners from like a single Instagram post, at least not yet. I also would love to expand my podcast website and add categories that you can sort through with episodes once there are more episodes that make sense. So for example, maybe like fashion episodes, beauty episodes, digital media episodes, travel episodes, things like that. I would love to ultimately like be one of those girlies who's recording in a podcast studio in New York City. I would love to be one of those girlies who is recording in a podcast studio in New York City and get help on the production front and the editing front to make everything more professional. But I think that's just a longer term goal for me right now. Okay, for another goal, I wrote guests ? And I wanted to put this out to you all to get your feelings on when a podcast has guests on. For me, I listen to very few podcasts that have a solo host, but when I do, I really enjoy spending time with that person, and I wouldn't necessarily listen to every single episode where they do have a guest on, because sometimes it just feels like, no, this was my time to catch up with this person. It's like, oh, I'm so excited to get coffee with my friend you haven't seen in a while, and then they like bring their new boyfriend along, and you're like, oh, I was kind of hoping it would just be the two of us. Sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, sometimes the new boyfriend is actually great, but let's be honest, sometimes it's also just a little bit like, oh, this really wasn't what I expected. So I just wanted to hear from you all. If you have opinions about guests, leave a comment over on Instagram or DM me. You could send me an email too. I personally have noticed that on podcasts where there are two hosts, like I listen to them usually for the banter, and sometimes when they have a guest or a third person, I wish it was back to just the two of them. I find more with solo podcasts. Well, I don't know. I feel like it really is case by case and it depends on the guest. And obviously, I would want to bring on guests who I already have some kind of friendship or relationship with, so that I'm not just like, speaking to someone for the very first time on the podcast. So I don't know. I, in theory, would like to, I think, have some guests on in the future, but when I first dreamed up this podcast, I did kind of see it as a solo project. So you guys let me know what you think about that. And I just wanted to share some things I'm thinking about coming up. I obviously think that it would be fun to do more career episodes. I think commenting on niche trends or having episodes about that. I kind of unintentionally did that with my episode to lock in and hit your goals by 2025. I realize a lot of people are referring to that as your winter arc on other platforms. So little things like that could be fun. I definitely want to do some gift episodes slash holiday episodes as we head into the holiday season. And yeah, I just like having these conversations that I think now that I'm broadening my YouTube channel, I just want to make sure there's enough different content on the podcast versus on my YouTube channel. And I want the podcast stuff to be stuff that maybe doesn't require as many visual aids as like a YouTube video would. For example, obviously I had like my Autumn Girlies Rise Up fall episode, and that was fun to listen to. But then I did a very visual heavy vlog on YouTube recently called A Perfect Autumn Day in New York. And that to me benefited from having like the visuals along with it. Whereas the other fall episode I recorded was a lot more general. You can kind of take that list and apply it to your own situation versus, I don't know, the New York specific one. In my head, it was more like helpful to have those visuals there too in the form of a YouTube video. So that is something that I'm just going to continue to try to balance and keep in mind as I now have these two long form platforms that have a bit more flexibility and fewer boundaries to them. In my eyes, we can only go up from here. The first 6 months, I think, are definitely the hardest to get through. And I'm excited for another 6 months and to celebrate my first year of the podcast next May. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. As a reminder, you can support Create and Consume for free by doing any of the following. You can leave me Apple and Spotify ratings and reviews. You can like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're watching over on YouTube. You can follow along at Create and Consume Pod on Instagram and TikTok. You could send this episode to a friend who might enjoy it. And as always, don't forget to check out createandconsumepodcast.com for episode recaps and more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.